We will look at one more domain of language use in the society, and that particular domain happens to be language teaching. As you understand, we have been looking at the complexity involving relationships between language and society. The two, language and society, are complex in their relationship in unique ways. Language is a tool for communication in the society, and society functions vitally on the basis of the use of language. There is a unique relationship between the two. They depend on each other in unique ways, and this relationship requires certain specific types of tools to understand such underlying complexities. We have been looking at several aspects of these relationships, several aspects of how they work together, how language works in society, and one such domain happens to be language teaching. We have looked at language independently. We have looked at language as a technical tool, language as a system, and we have also looked at society and have developed an understanding of society vis-a-vis language. We will need to understand language teaching and how our understanding of the relationship between language and society and our understanding of language helps us understand this unique relationship, and how we enrich the entire enterprise of language teaching on the basis of such an understanding of this relationship. Language teaching happens to be, if not the oldest, definitely one of the oldest professions of the world. Oldest profession, oldest enterprise. Language is one of the first things to pay attention to when we need to interact with other societies or groups within the same society. Therefore, the teaching of language has always been revised, always been improved and looked at in a very serious way. Besides this being the oldest profession and a significant profession in the society, it has drawn significantly from the study of language. The study of language is what we called the larger discipline, linguistics. And on the basis of the various aspects of the study of language, we draw a lot for how teaching programs, teaching methods must be revised. So, we will go through a little bit of how the study of language has helped and is being helpful in language teaching. The insights from each domain of the study of language have been helpful in understanding language teaching. First of all, let us look at the domains that we are talking about. We have talked about these domains in various contexts, in various domains of understanding language. So, for that matter, we have looked at the structure part of language, and the structure involves understanding of sounds, understanding of words, their relationship with each other, sentences, that is how a sentence is formed, what are the vital and required component of making of a sentence. And this is once again important for us to understand in a unique way, that when we define sounds, we just look at some consonants and vowel sounds, and when we move ahead and look at what makes a word, we usually are tempted to conclude by saying words are collection of sounds. Sounds group together and make words. However, what we have seen is it is not merely a random collection of sounds. There are principles underlying for what can be combined together and what could not be possible combinations to make a sound. It is the possibility and impossibility of particular combinations which becomes significant and gets part of being what we know as generative capacity. And it is that understanding which helps us really get into the details of what it makes, what it takes to make a word. Similarly, we know that sentences are not random collection of words. Sentences are much more than that. In a way, a sentence could be infinitely long, and still a sentence will have only one verb. So definitely an infinitely long sentence will have infinite number of words. Therefore, the total number of words as being part of a sentence is definitely not significant. What is important is the functional aspects of a sentence, that is tense, aspects, agreement, and the structural relationships like subjects, objects, predicates, and well designed program along with that for understanding of a sentence. Similarly, the next level is discourse, and it is an important point for us to understand that what constitutes discourse is context, and the domains of sentence used in context, sentences without context is not discourse. Sentences in a context is discourse, and from this point we start looking at the use of language in society. While looking at discourse, we are clearly not paying attention to the structural aspects of sentence, rather we are looking at discourse, we are looking at the discourse, and what is relevant in that discourse is what comes from society, what comes from environment. And when we start looking at society, community, language together, what we interact with is diversity. The study of diversity in terms of variations within language, beyond languages, and their complexities that they create for the use of language in the society with respect to how language works in human mind and social cognition along with, are the aspects which we need to be looking at and what we have looked at in order to develop our understanding for language. Linguistic insights for the study of society via language has also been contributing significantly for understanding language teaching. For example, a clear understanding of standard and non-standard distinction, and more importantly so, the point that there is nothing as such scientifically viable becomes very significant for language teaching. The question or the point that a language is not a viable idea, rather what we need to understand and look at language from the multilingual perspective, and we want to treat language as multilinguality, will be immensely helpful in language teaching. Similarly, with an example of English as the underlying point in understanding why English has acquired its distinct identity in Indian subcontinent and why it should not be looked at as one of the Englishes spoken around the world, rather it should be looked at as one of the members of the languages spoken in this subcontinent. Such points will immensely contribute to the language teaching. If we tend to ignore any one of them, then we are going to run into contradictions. We would want to achieve something which would not exist in the society. For example, if we want to practice purity of language in teaching language, then we know that we are teaching which does not exist in the society. And if we, as teachers, if we want to insist on purity and the use of language in a particular way, then we are going to be running into difficulty again. Therefore, a combination of the understanding of linguistic insights from the from the study of structure of language and from the study of the context and language as social entity put together, a program in language teaching can be devised and will work more efficiently. So, things that have come as part of the new insights by looking at acquisition part of language are our understanding about behaviorism and mentalism. And more importantly, when we want to understand both without being prejudiced, we understand that behaviorism and mentalism are not in total contradiction with each other, rather they compensate one another. We have looked at it in details that for behaviorism, language was considered as human behavior. What was not looked at and what was missing from behaviorism was the emphasis on the role of human mind, because most of the processing that takes place by the generative capacity is part of human mind. And what we must not ignore in understanding language as a phenomena of human mind is the role of input which comes from the society and the immediate environment. Therefore, they must not be in total contradiction, and this will be one of the insights which are going to be vital for our understanding of two aspects of language acquisition, two independently designed theories, namely behaviorist model of understanding language acquisition and mentalist model of understanding language acquisition. And this is going to be playing a very significant role in coming up with an approach for language teaching. Similarly, grammar of culture, grammar of variation and change and the grammar of society have a lot in common and in sync with the fundamentals of language. That is, we have talked about a relationship between language and culture. We have talked about what variation means within language and beyond languages. We have looked at what language change is about. And when we put all of them together, we want to look at these terms we want to understand them in terms of grammar of culture, grammar of variation, grammar of society. That is a more technical understanding of society. And these are, just like they are not independent from one another, language as an idea, language and an idea can exist elsewhere, but language as an entity and language which gets its proper use in the society would not exist without society as well. So, such an understanding also gives us new insights in terms of how we understand native speakers, in terms of how we understand language and the question of dialects, how we understand continuum and the question of language fluidity. So, language can only be seen, and that helps us understand that language can only be seen in terms of a continuum and not as a countable entity. This whole thing would not make sense unless we look at the point that language boundaries are not rigid. Language boundaries are totally fluid and porous. Languages merge with one another at every single levels of its understanding, every single levels of its every single levels of its structure. So, learning of language has the genesis of learning embedded in it. We get to this final point only when we understand language can be understood in a continuum, language can be understood as a fluidity, and there is a bigger role of language and its relationship with society in understanding of learning and teaching of language, and at the same time some of the theoretical models in terms of the acquisition of language will also help us understand the teaching properly, that is the teaching of language properly. I want to draw your attention to one of the examples in how it becomes helpful, that is how the insights that we have been discussing becomes helpful in teaching of language. Some of you may have experience in teaching of language, but almost all of you must have gone through the learning of language, and in particular a second language. If it is possible, I want you to pause here and think how you learned any language that you have learned in a classroom. And I want to make a safe assumption here that definitely many of you as subscribers to this course would have gone through learning of English, which must have taken place as second language for you. Some of you have learned Hindi as the second language, or for that matter you may have learned any language as the second language. I want to discuss one particular aspect of plural markers with examples from English and Hindi, and then I want you to look at the points and apply some of them to what you have learned as second language, and then see how the insights into understanding of several structural aspects of language have a lot to tell us in terms of language teaching. When we look at plural markers, the first thing in English, or for that matter any language, we want to change the shift, we want to change the focus from written language to a spoken language. And I want you to bear this in mind, that we are only talking about these rules on the basis of observations and generalizations from spoken language, and how the data and the generalization drawn from the data have been explained. So, what we derive as s and z as two sounds are plural morphemes in English. In other words, these are the plural marking sounds in English. When you look at the final sound of a word, please pay attention to that. If the word ends with three stop sounds pa, ta and ka, the plural marker in English sounds like s. Like books, the final consonant is a ka, the plural marker is going to sound like s, books. Cap, the final consonant of this word cap is pa, happens to be a stop, therefore the plural marker is going to sound like caps. And you can look at more examples. Everywhere else it is going to sound z. So, here is the rule that we can state with simplicity. Sa occurs if the word ends with a stop sound like pa, ta and ka, and ja occurs everywhere else. Take any other word which ends with anything other than pa, ta and ka, the plural marker is going to sound z. Take an example, take a look at the dictionary, pay attention to the speakers of the language. So, we may be writing the words in any which way we want, following the conventions of English spelling system, English writing system, but when we speak, the words are going to sound different. So, when we say, take an example friend, we are not going to be written part as the plural marker being added to this word is s. What we are going to look at is the plural marker is going to sound like z, it is friends. And likewise, when we say watch, a plural marker that we add is completely something else, and what it is going to sound like is a j sound. So, I once again want you to understand that please do not look at how these words are written. You are expected to look at what they sound like. So, most of the rules that we are taught in classrooms, or you were taught in classrooms, where you were told those rules on the basis of how those things are written, and thus such a thing is going to generate lot of rules and lot of exceptions. However, when you derive generalizations on the basis of spoken examples, you find a rule as simple as this one, and then this is the explanatory capacity of this model, of this understanding, that they are not going to be generating exceptions. However, words like children and oxen, teeth, deer, these are few examples which are reminiscence of Old English in modern English spoken today. Similarly, when you look at plural markers in Hindi, you are going to see plural marking works in a very distinct way for Hindi. Gender in Hindi is grammatical, that is, gender plays a role in grammar of the language. So, looking at plural markings in the language, what we find that all the nouns are divided in two parts, masculine and feminine. Please understand, the assignment of gender to nouns in Hindi is arbitrary, and it is left to the intuitions of native speakers. That adds even more complexity to teaching of plural marking morphemes in Hindi. First of all, there is no way to teach why a word should be masculine or a feminine, and then we face the difficulty when we start that such a thing is going to have consequences in the grammar. For that, to resolve that kind of paradox, when we look at the nouns in two categories as masculine and feminine to begin with, what we say, and of course on the basis of intuition of native speakers, what we find is within masculine nouns there are two patterns. One is, if the word ends with a, then the a changes to a, and then we get a plural marker. There are hundreds of examples of that. Kamra becoming kamre, tala becoming tale. Kamra is a Hindi word for room, tala is a Hindi word for lock, and so on, and you can take more examples. You can do this exercise on your own, verify. This will be one of the significant exercises that you will do for yourself to understand the applications of these insights. Moving ahead, when you look at the second type of second type of nouns in masculine, that is every noun, every other noun which would not end in a, there will be no plural marker. For example, admi, ghar, purush, phal, pair, take any example, they are not going to have a plural counterpart, they are going to remain the same way. That is, the plural marker is a 0. When you look at a feminine group of nouns in Hindi, you are going to see a word, if the word ends with long e, that is a vowel, then you are going to see the plural marker ending in a particular way, like ladki, girl becoming ladkiyan, khirki, window becoming khirkiyan, and so on. Whereas, when the word ends with anything other than long e, it has a different pattern, and that pattern is a. So, a word like kitab, which does not end with a long e, it will have a plural marker of a different sort, and the word will be kitabe. Bhasha, it is a vowel but not long e, therefore, it will follow the same pattern, and the plural marking will be bhashaye. Take more examples to see that. I want you to pay attention to this slide on your screen. I want you to pay attention to these rules and then see that the understanding of morpheme and understanding of sounds in its features and the role of these sounds and these features in the grammar, they are all parts of phonetics, phonology, morphology, morphosyntax and syntax. All these things, all these subparts of the study of the structure of language is going to help us derive generalizations and explain the empirical data with the precision in the rules, and that is going to be helpful in teaching of language. There are three aspects of language teaching, in particular language, the learning aspect, learning about the language and learning through the language. Teaching methods are related to learning of language. There have been several teaching methods applicable for teaching of language. Right up front, I want to make a note that no method in isolation has been ultimately successful. One can always argue to a certain point that one method has been better than the other one, but no one method has worked in an ultimate way. If it did, then we would not need another method. That is my hunch. However, you see on the screen we have, in the history of language teaching, we have had several methods. And I would like to make another point before getting into the details of this, that what has actually worked in the enterprise of language teaching is combination of many methods together. So, grammar translation method in particular, as the name reflects, was focusing on grammar and translating into the target language was the particular methodology for this. The focus was reading and definitely not speaking. In rest of the methods that you see, direct method, audiolingual method, communicative method and natural approach, the focus shifted completely to the spoken part, and then they vary from one another in various aspects, in more aspects than one, and I invite you to look at the details of these methods which are available for your reading list as well. And then we progress, and finally we have come to the point of what is called natural approach in language teaching, which was developed by Stephen Krashen by bringing insights from all other methods and particularly focusing on the input that goes into learning, and because they focus on input, this is also called input hypothesis model, where the input is argued to be comprehensible. And then again, I want you to look at what the principles of grammar translation methods are and why they worked and did not work. And likewise, the principles of direct method, principles of audiolingual method, principles of communicative methods, and what is involved in natural approach, how these methods are different from one another, and what are the common aspects of these methods. Thank you.